Hey everyone, Noah Zerbe here. This is one of a series of short videos looking at contemporary environmental challenges in the context of global politics. This video looks in particular at the idea of the tragedy of the commons and systems to govern the commons, or to manage shared resources. There's a lot to unpack here, so let's get into it. The idea of the tragedy of the commons was first articulated by Garrett Hardin in a 1968 article. In that article, Hardin imagines a hypothetical pasture on which several shepherds are grazing their flocks. Hardin argues that the shared nature of the pasture meant that each shepherd garnered 100% of the benefits of grazing additional sheep, but only paid a portion of the costs associated with doing so. As a result, Hardin contended that the rational decision for any individual shepherd was to continue to increase the number of sheep grazing in the commons, adding sheep after sheep. As each shepherd does this, however, the commons were gradually overgrazed and eventually destroyed. Or, to quote Hardin, the rational herdsman concludes that the only sensible course for him to pursue is to add another animal to his herd, and another, and another. But this conclusion is reached by each and every rational herdsman sharing the commons. Therein is the tragedy. Each man is locked into a system that compels him to increase his herd without limit in a world that is limited. Ruin is the destination towards which all men rush, each pursuing his own best interest in a society that believes in freedom of the commons. The problem, as Hardin views it, is rooted in the nature of the goods themselves. Remember back to the video where we looked at the collective goods dilemma. In the commons, we're looking at goods which are rivalrous in consumption but have little excludability in access. That is, it's difficult to exclude individuals from consuming the commons, but one person's use of the commons undermines the abilities of others to use the commons. When we think of the commons, we're usually thinking of things like fisheries or commonly held pastures and even the environment in the context of greenhouse gas emissions. It should be clear that many of the contemporary environmental challenges we face have the characteristics both of common pool resources and of a prisoner's dilemma. Consider, for example, the problem of greenhouse gas emissions. While we'll explore the question of climate change in another video, for now let's consider why it's so difficult to get countries to agree on binding greenhouse gas emissions targets. Global climate change affects every country in the world, regardless of the degree to which they contribute to the problem. Similarly, preventing catastrophic climate change is in the best interest of every country, but no country can be excluded from the benefits. As a result, individual countries behaving in a rational and self-interested manner have strong incentives to continue to pollute. The benefits of greenhouse gas emissions, more economic activity at a lower cost, accrue to the individual country, while the costs of greenhouse gas emissions are shared by the global community. Even if every country wants to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, they would prefer that other countries pay the cost to do so, free riding on the work of other countries. But if every country behaves in the same way, we're collectively worse off. Remember back to game theory and the prisoner's dilemma. We see the same basic framework at play here. In this payoff matrix, I've rank ordered the preferences for country A. Country A's best choice, or most favored choice, would be for it to continue to pollute while country B stops. This way, country A gets the benefits of the economic growth and avoids climate change. Conversely, its least favored choice would be to pay the costs for cleaning up the environment while other countries continue to pollute. Note that with the previous example, regardless of the decision of other countries, I'm always better off polluting. Back in our language of game theory, the Nash equilibrium here is Pareto suboptimal. And to be clear, it's not just greenhouse gas emissions that can be understood through the lens of the global commons. Many other global environmental challenges fit this model as well. We can think of things like the loss of global biodiversity, the collapse of global fish stocks due to overfishing, the race to access resources located under the world's oceans and those made accessible by retreating sea ice, the ozone layer, access to the Antarctic, or even resources in space, ranging from satellite orbit locations, which are surprisingly running out of number due to widespread presence of space junk, another collective goods dilemma, as well as the expanding number of satellites in orbit. And to be clear, this list is far from comprehensive. So what's the solution? How do we address these challenges? From Hardin's perspective, the solution to the tragedy was to find a way to force individuals to internalize those costs that they might otherwise seek to externalize to the commons. The easiest way to do this, according to Hardin, was to enclose the commons, turning what was at one point collective shared resources into private property. In doing so, according to Hardin, the individual shepherd would keep all of the profits from their activities, but would also bear all of the costs. The system would force them to behave in a more sustainable way. It would force them to internalize those externalities associated with the commons. Hardin also suggested that another possible outcome, though one he clearly viewed as suboptimal, would be regulation, which he described as mutual coercion mutually agreed upon. This could, and in practice often does, take a wide variety of forms, from regulatory policies to subsidies to tradable rights to user fees. But all of these have implications for economic efficiency and competitiveness, technical and scientific innovation, and government costs and revenues. But at the international level, the situation is further complicated by the lack of an international organization capable of forcing states to behave in particular ways. That is to say, at the domestic level, the state may be able to establish property rights or use taxes or regulatory policy to address collective goods problems, but at the international level, things get more complicated. The existence of global inequality and the need to achieve consensus make matters more difficult. As we'll consider when we look at climate change in more detail, the question of who should bear the cost of addressing climate change is complicated by countries' different levels of economic development and sharp disagreements over the scope and scale of action needed to address the problem. Further, international negotiations are often complicated by a host of other factors, including the veto power, shifting policy coalitions, international trade dynamics and self-interested states, differential economic power between states, public opinion, bargaining among stakeholders, and a host of other factors. But let's return for a moment to Hardin's central contention about the commons, namely that freedom in the commons brings ruin to all. That this threat necessitates either expanding government regulation or, in Hardin's view, preferably enclosure of the commons. Was he correct, or are there ways to manage the commons outside of governmental regulation and privatization? The work of Elinor Ostrom suggests that there is. Ostrom's work looked at case studies of successful systems of commons management from around the world. She was particularly interested in cases where commons were managed without enclosure, that is, without privatizing them, and without governmental intervention. Interestingly, she found dozens of examples to draw from, including Swiss alpine meadows, irrigation systems in Nepal, fisheries in Sri Lanka and Turkey. All told, Ostrom found dozens of examples of successfully managed commons, and her work on them won the Nobel Prize in Economics, making her the first woman and the first political scientist to win such recognition. But what exactly did she find? What emerges from Ostrom's analysis of dozens of successful systems for managing the commons is a list of characteristics that define effective, non-state, non-market-based solutions. These include that common pool resources have clearly defined boundaries, and that there must be a mechanism to exclude non-participated or unentitled parties from accessing the commons. There must be rules governing extraction and appropriation of resources from the commons, and they must be adapted to local conditions. There's no one-size-fits-all solution. Decision-making processes within the commons must be open to all appropriators. That is, the people using the commons must have a hand in collectively deciding how they will be managed. Effective monitoring mechanisms must exist, either performed directly by the people in the commons or at least accountable to them. There must be a scale or graduated sanctions against those who violate community rules governing management of the commons. There must also be expensive and readily available dispute settlement mechanisms to resolve conflicts between parties in the commons. The right of community members to manage the commons must be recognized by higher-level authorities in the government. In other words, local systems of governance must have some degree of autonomy from centralized state control, but must be respected by them. And finally, in the case of larger common pool resources, there must be nested systems connecting higher and lower levels of oversight. Ostrom's analysis of the fishery district in Alanya in Turkey provides a good example of this. In the 1970s, the community's fisheries were at risk of depletion through overfishing. But unlike other fisheries where a race to the bottom ensued, the community in Alanya developed a solution to address the common pool problem. Their solution was a simple but effective one. The fishery was divided into sectors. At the start of the season, the community met to draw lots, assigning each fisher to a specific sector for that day. At the start of each day, the fisher would rotate to the next sector, with daily rotations continuing through the entire season. Each fisher thus had an opportunity to fish the best spots, and the system was enforced by the fishers themselves, with the government recognizing the customs and rules established by the community itself. These rules govern both the location of fishing that take place and the technologies used in fishing. Of course, such a system depended on the features outlined by Ostrom, but it also depended on an understanding of progress and development that was rooted in a more sustainable lifestyle. Such a system would quickly collapse, for example, if giant trawlers were able to sweep through and catch all of the fish in the area. It also suggests a willingness to accept a slightly lower standard of living in exchange for a more sustainable livelihood. Some collective vision of decision-making that extends into the future rather than one that's merely concerned with short-term or immediate gains. And it provides some helpful and perhaps hopeful vision of what a future governance system for the commons might look like. So that concludes our overview of systems to govern the commons. I hope you found it interesting. Thanks for watching, everyone, and have a good day. Goodbye.